Welcome back to part 3, where we'll take things one step further and look at having multiple functions and even calling multiple functions in a row. First, let's make a second function for ChatGPT to call. We have ChatGPT with access to the current weather right now. So let's also give it access to the weather forecast. Open your weather.py file in the APIs folder and just keep all the imports and the existing function as is, and just scroll down to the bottom to start the declaration of a new function below. So I'm just going to get rid of this print statement here, and we declare a function that takes a location argument and a number of days, which defaults to 7 if not provided. The function will return a string again for ChatGPT, which needs strings, and then we try to set the days to 1 if the days is less to 1, so if the user provides a negative value somehow, and we set it to 1, and if it's more than 14 we set it to 14, and else it just stays whatever it was because there's no problem. And if there's a type error, so if this is like a string penguin instead of a number, then we just set the days to 7, so it defaults anyway. That's just a little bit of safety checking. Then we define our parameters, which again the key is just the API key loaded from our .env file using the config method. Q, we pass in the location, days is the number of days, and then we have the air quality index and the alerts again, which we'll just set to no for now. Now we're going to continue below here and actually make our API call. We make a request.get call, passing in the API address and the params dictionary. We catch the return in response, which is a request.models.response type object. And then we're going to use the .json method, which is present on this object as we discussed just a moment before, which returns a dictionary. So this response is now of type dictionary. Now this response dictionary has, I have a copy here, has an enormous amount of data. It has the location, the current weather, the forecast for this day, but then it actually gets into hourly forecast as well. So the amount of data here is absolutely enormous. And if we send all this back to ChatGPT, it is way too much. So we're actually going to filter out this 4,000 line massive object and only send back what we need. So first we make an empty dictionary called filtered response. We then set the location key of this new filtered response dictionary to the responses key of location, which just holds the location of our weather forecast. Then we set the filtered responses current key to the responses current key, which just has the current weather in that particular location. And then we're going to set the filtered responses forecast key using this list comprehension. This list comprehension takes the responses forecast day key, which skips all the hourly forecasts, so like 95% of the information is gone already. And this response forecast day is a list of the different days in our forecast. So we're going to loop over this list for day in this list of days, which is located in this location. So for each day in this particular location in the object, we're going to extract the day date key and the day key, which basically gives us the time and the basic weather for that particular day. So this looks very confusing, but this is just a list which is located in this particular location, and we're going to loop over every day, and we're just saying give me the date and the weather, which is under a key called day, for every single day in here. So it's just going to give us a list with Wednesday the weather forecast is this, and on Thursday the weather forecast is this, and that's going under the forecast key. Then we're going to return the dump string version because we need this dictionary as a string. since ChatGPT needs strings. So we're just going to return the string function of all this information. So our weather forecast data has now gone from about 4,000 lines to about 1/20th of that, cutting away all the hourly data. This is much more manageable, and the weather data we send to ChatGPT will look something like this now. We have the location, we have the current weather, and then we have the forecast object with a list of days and their respective weather, and the next day and that weather, and the next day and that weather. So that's a lot more manageable. Of course, if you're in a production environment and lots of people are going to be using your application, then you'll want to filter out any and all data that can be left out at a granular level to save tokens, as the number of users is going to be very large. But for now, for our users, this is going to be fine. So your get weather forecast location now looks like this. It first checks the day, sets the parameters, gets the response, and then filters out the response. So let's actually check it out, and I'm going to print the get weather forecast. I'm going to pass in Sol and ask for 3 days, and let's run this and see what we get back. So yeah, that's a pretty big object. Seoul, South Korea, and then it has the current weather, and it's pretty hard to find in here, but yeah, I can see different days here. Yep, different days, so that's working perfect. Now, make sure again to either comment out or remove this print statement, because we don't want it running every time we import this file. And we'll also need a function description for this new function to give to ChatGPT. So go to your function descriptions, and this one is also weather related, so we can just add it in the same file. And we're going to have another function description, describe get weather forecast. Now, most of this is familiar from the function descriptions we've made so far. And note that we simply added a new key to the properties named days of the type integer with a description the number of days to forecast between 1 and 14. So our properties object now simply has 2 entries, and we're saying that the location is required, but we're not stating the days as required because we have a default value for it. If the user doesn't ask for any specific number of days, we're just going to give them 7 days by default. And again, our description just states exactly what the function does. So try to avoid telling ChatGPT what to do in here, and just say, hey, this function does this. This function provides the weather forecast in a specific location for a specified number of days. That's it. So now that we have both these weather functions and weather function descriptions, let's actually have some fun. So I'm going to name this new file CA multifunction weather gpt.py, and I'm going to stick with the alphabetical naming convention again, but you can use more sensible names. This is just for tutorial purposes. So inside this file, let's start with our imports and setup again, and we're just going to import JSON, the OpenAI config to set our OpenAI key here, and then from apis.weather we import both our functions. From the function descriptions we import both our functions, and of course we import our lovely color printer we made in tutorial part 1. So having all these files and functions in different files helps us keep our code readable and organized. If we put all these functions in this single file, it becomes one huge mess. So now let's start our function below the imports. And again, we don't provide any setup, but we get straight into the user query in the messages list. The function list has 2 functions now, as we have 2 available functions. And then we make the GPT call as we're used to, passing in the model, the messages, the functions, and the function call, and we'll leave it up to ChatGPT again whether it should or should not call a function. And then we append the message to the messages history. Now we again, this is where we left off, we again test if there is a function call in the first response. If not, we just skip the whole block and we can just print the messages and return the first response. So that's kind of just skip everything. Then we define our available functions. Again, this is the ChatGPT names and this is the actual function names. They don't have to be the same, but as long as these are references to the real functions. Then we get the function name from the first response function called name. So this is indexing into the object that ChatGPT sent us to get the function name of the function that has to be called, which is relevant now because we have multiple functions. So ChatGPT could tell us to call this function, but it could also tell us to call this function. Then we get the function to call from the available functions object by passing in the function name. So if ChatGPT wants to call this function, it's going to give us this name. And I gave them different names just to show you that it doesn't matter. So whatever one of these two names ChatGPT sends to us, we'll get the actual reference to the real function and store it here. Then we get the function arguments by running json.loads on the specific location that holds the arguments. Then we can simply get the function response by calling the function to call, which is either one of these functions depending on what ChatGPT sent us, and then we unpack the function arguments in there. So whatever arguments there are, because they could be different for different functions, so we need to write this in a more generic manner right now. Whatever functions there are, we're just going to pass them along. Then we're going to append a new message with the function again, and I need to actually change this to the function name here. I made a small mistake. This is not random word. This is whatever function name we passed in. And then the content is the function response. Now we're going to get the second response, which is just another simple ChatGPT call. And then we append the second response to the messages, printing our message history for our own reference and returning the second response's content in the end. So now we have our AskGPT function, which has our messages, two possible functions. So it will choose whichever to call if it wants to call a function. We get the first response, append it, see if there is a function call. If there is, we define the available functions, get the function we need to call, load the arguments and call the function. Then we append the actual response. We get the second GPT call, append it, and then print whatever the result is, or print whatever the result of the first call was if no function has been called. So let's test it out. So I'm just going to start with a generic test call. We're going to ask, what is the most delicious fruit? This should not trigger any function call whatsoever. And we should just get a political answer. As an AI, I don't have a personal preference and no function was called. So now we'll try what is the weather in Amsterdam. This should trigger our first function to get the current weather in location, passing in the location of Amsterdam, perfect, and gives us a nice natural language response. Now we're going to ask the big question, what is the weather forecast in Leipzig for the coming 3 days? And this should trigger our weather forecast function. Fingers crossed that it works. Of course it works, because we're professionals, right? Okay, here it comes. And get weather forecast in location. Location Leipzig, days 3. We get all this information, and then beautiful, the weather forecast in Leipzig for the coming 3 days is as follows. August the 9th is, well, okay, August the 10th is slightly better, and August the 11th is looking pretty good. Sunny with 27.4 degrees temperature with no chance of rain. That sounds pretty good. So ChatGPT is now choosing whether to call a function, and if, then which function it should call. So that's pretty cool, and so far that was pretty easy, but now let's have some fun and get it to call multiple functions in a row. First, we'll do some prep work again. In your APIs folder, create a new file called chatgpt.py, in which we'll abstract away the ChatGPT call we've been repeating over and over. So we import OpenAI and our decouple.config module to set our key as always. Then we declare a function GPT-3.5 turbo 0613 call, in which we pass in a messages object containing the history, and then optionally functions which defaults to none, and the function call, whether it should call a specific function or whether we leave the choice up to ChatGPT. Then we define a parameters object dictionary in which we hardcode the model because we always want to use this model for the function calls to work. Then we pass in the messages in the dictionary under messages, and if we specified functions, then the parameters functions key will have the functions, and the parameters function call key will have the function call. Then we simply return the chatCompletion.create call, passing in the unpacked parameters in there. So from now on, we can just import this function and call it without writing out this same code over and over again. So go ahead and save and close this file for now. Before we attempt to call multiple functions in a row, we will use a setup system message instead of passing the user query straight to ChatGPT as the first message. To keep our code readable, let's make a new folder again, prompt_setups, and inside this folder make a new file called weather.py. Then we're simply going to put a variable in there containing the setup. Current and forecast setup is you are a regular ChatGPT chatbot just like normal. However, you also have access to some functions that can be called if you need them. One will provide the current weather and one will provide the weather forecast. You will not communicate with the user until you finish all function calls. You will not send a finish reason of stop until you finish all function calls. And this sort of setup just comes about by playing around, seeing what kind of problems ChatGPT runs into, and then just giving an instruction, hey, don't do that, do this instead. And that's kind of how your instructions get formed. Now go ahead and save and close this file as well. And now it's time to have some fun. Go back to your base directory and make this cb multi-functions multi-calls.py file. Again, I'm using the alphabetic names just to get them to line up nicely. Don't use this in a real software development project. And let's start by adding our imports in here. All of these should look relatively familiar. Except I made a small mistake here. Oh, it's called ChatGPT. I made a mistake here. ChatGPT. That's why our import was not working and now it's working fine. We made a small mistake. So we're importing all our own functions and descriptions and the JSON module. Okay, so let's get started on our function definition. We pass in a list of messages where we use our setup we just made in a separate setup file and folder. We declare the list of functions again, passing in our function descriptions we made in our function descriptions.weatherPI for ChatGPT to understand what these functions are and what they do. As we're not sure this time about how many calls we'll be making, we'll just name it current response instead of first response. and notice the ChatGPT function call is much simplified using our apis.chatgpt.py module we just made. We catch the response in the current response, and then we index into it to get the current message, which we append to the message's history. We then set a Boolean variable to either true or false, depending on whether the current message has a function call key. So it's true if the current message.get function call returns something, and else it will be false. All right, so now we'll start a while loop. This is where we left off before I copy pasted this in. We start a while loop that will run as long as is calling function is true, because this time we need to be able to loop through this multiple times because we'll be calling multiple functions potentially. Inside the loop, again, we make a dictionary of available functions. This is the ChatGPT name of the function we gave in the function description, and this is a reference to the actual function. We get the function name from the current message, so ChatGPT is telling us I want to call the function with this name. We extract the reference to the real function using our available functions dictionary. We load the function arguments using JSON from the arguments ChatGPT sent us that, okay, I want to call the function with these arguments. And then we simply get the function response, which is a function call passing in our unpacked function arguments. Then, of course, we append this function call as another message to our messages history, as we did several times before. Then we have current response, which is another ChatGPT call, again passing in our messages, but we also keep passing in our functions this time because we might make multiple function calls, so we have to pass in our messages and our functions every single time. Again, we get the current message by just indexing into the current response. We append this message as well to the messages history. And this time, instead of finishing, we declare this Boolean variable again, which we did above here. True if current message.get function call, else false. So we're checking again, is there a function call in the current message.get function call? So if it wants to call another function, this Boolean will remain true, which will trigger the while loop again, and this will just keep running as long as ChatGPT is telling us, hey, I want to make another function call. So this is just looping and looping until ChatGPT is done calling its functions, and then we print and just return the content. So for a quick review, we have our imports, we declare our function, we have the messages functions, we get the current response and append it, see if there is a function call, and while there is a function call, we have this loop. We declare the available functions, which is kind of wasteful putting it in the loop because we'll redeclare it several times, but we won't be calling this millions of times, so it's fine for now. Then we get whichever function you want to call and call it, passing in the arguments ChatGPT provided for us, append it to the messages. We get another response from ChatGPT and see if there's more function calls, loop over it, and when it's done, we return the end result. So let's first test if we didn't break anything. So I'm just going to ask it again, what is the most delicious fruit? And it'll refuse to answer again. As an AI, I don't have a personal preference. Hey, so boring. Okay, now let's ask the next question. What is the weather in Seoul? And it should still call our get current weather function. Yes, get current weather in location Seoul. That's working perfectly. Let's test for the weather forecast in Hamburg for the coming 3 days, just making sure we did not break anything. And let's see what we get. Is it still working correctly? Get current weather forecast in location. Hamburg, days 3. Yep. Looking good. So now let's ask you the fun question. Please give me the current weather in Seoul and the weather forecast in Amsterdam for the coming 3 days in a single response. So I'm in Seoul, but I'm taking an airplane to Amsterdam this afternoon, I guess, and I want to know what is the weather when I arrive, but I also want to know the current weather because I have to go to the airport and I just want to know both of them, I guess. So let's run this and see if ChatGPT will do a good job for us in a single answer, calling multiple functions. So let's give it a moment. Yep. Okay, we have the system message, the user query. Assistant calls get current weather in location for the location Seoul, gets the answer. Then it immediately calls get weather forecast in location, location Amsterdam days 3, gets another answer. And now it comes up with its answer. The current weather in Seoul is yada 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 yada. Then it says the weather forecast for Amsterdam, Netherlands for the coming 3 days is as follows. And it has the 3 days neatly lined up. So there you go. That's pretty cool, isn't it? ChatGPT called our get current weather function for Seoul and then called our weather forecast function for Amsterdam, combining both answers in a single human readable response. This is pretty mind-blowing stuff. It actually feels like some kind of intelligence is helping us out here. It doesn't feel like purely deterministic code. It almost actually feels like there's someone helping us. So that's pretty crazy. So now that we've gone pretty deep into extending ChatGPT's powers using internet APIs, let's take this up another notch and connect up a database for ChatGPT to query instead of an API to call. We'll do this in the next tutorial. So I'll see you there soon.